me ask you a couple questions about the substance of the budget. So the budget resolution that you put forward this year, and similar to ones that Congressman Ryan put forward when he was the chairman, have substantial cuts from the baseline in a lot of programs. Some estimates are that if you look at the non-defense cuts, that a large part of them, more than half, are in programs that are designed to serve low-income families or lower middle-class families. How do you reconcile the Paul Ryan's, Jack Kemp, we need to do something about poor people in America, and then the budgets seem to provide fewer and fewer federal resources aimed at that part of the population?
That's precisely the problem that we were defining before, and that is that the mandatory side tends to crowd out with programs that have been defined previously and aren't flexible, aren't responsive to the recipients. So even the programs that are supposed to assist those communities have been in place for such a period of time, or we aren't allowed to touch them because they're on the mandatory side. That the process reform would be wise to bring those into the loop of repeated.
But do you think that we devote too much of our budget aimed at lower income people, and we ought to spend less money there? Or do you think we ought to spend the same amount of money, do the programs differently, or do you think we ought to spend more money?
I think defining how much, what kind of resources you have before you define the mission and the goal, it gets you to folly. Again, people don't do that in their lives. Businesses don't do that. The folks who are responsible for states don't necessarily do that. What we need to do, defense is a classic example. We ought to define the mission, and then make certain that the mission is agreed to and accomplishes whatever it is that we as a nation believe ought to occur, and then provide the resources to accomplish that mission. That's one of the primary purposes of the federal government. Right now, we seem to have it backwards. We determine how much money we have and then shoehorn the mission into it. And that doesn't work in many, many ways. What that means, though, is that you've got to prioritize what the federal government does. Because the federal government does a lot of things that from our side of the aisle, we would suggest are not appropriate roles for the federal government.
So you can't answer the question whether you think we don't spend enough on defense?
I don't think no, I don't think we've looked at that.
But you're going to
on
defense. Yeah, defense. So you can define the mission,
yeah,
but you're going to have to do a budget resolution in the next several weeks. We're not going to clarify the mission or how to.
As has been described, the level that we're spending right now on defense from the folks who know, not the orthopedic surgeons, right, but the folks who know who are charged with making certain that the nation is secure and people are protected, say we're at the lower ragged edge of where we ought to be. Remember why this came about. This is a great example, though, of how the budget process has failed. And that is that in 2011, we had this grand idea, this bipartisan idea, in fact, much of it coming from the White House, that said we needed to save $2.1 trillion overall over the next 10 years. And the way to do that was to identify $1.2 trillion immediately, and then $900 billion was going to be found by the super committee. And if they didn't find it, out of mandatory spending, remember that $900 billion was supposed to come out of mandatory spending. And if they didn't find it, then we'd take it out of discretionary spending. So defense spending has decreased remarkably over the 10-year period of time because the committee was unable to come to an agreement. That's not a way. That's not a wise way to. I
agree with that, but I'm asking about the outcomes. Do you think we spend enough on defense, or we're going to have to spend more?
I think we're at the ragged lower edge.
Okay. Is there anything else you think we should spend more on?
I think the process to define that is through the committee process and the like. I think infrastructure has been lacking in terms of the investments that we've made in this country. We've got the city of Atlanta is a classic example. We've over the past number of years, the city of Atlanta has, and most large cities are like this. The infrastructure, water and sewer and the like, is at that age 80 to 100 years old. Well, it wasn't meant to last that long. And so I think infrastructure is one of those areas.
So what's the problem? I mean, we don't need it. It's one of the few things I think there's consensus on in Washington is we ought to spend more on infrastructure, yet that doesn't seem to be something that gets much traction in Congress. Why not?
Because in order to identify the level at which that area ought to get spending, you've got to identify areas where we ought to decrease federal involvement. The less slant is by and large to say, we need more money for infrastructure and don't worry about everything else. We'll just keep spending at that same level. And that's not, again, the way real people budget. It's not the way businesses budget. It's not the way states budget. You have to prioritize. And we do a terrible job in this town prioritizing on what we ought to spend.
Do you have a gut sense of where we ought to spend less?
Oh, I think that there's a pretty good debate about all sorts of areas, whether it's in the area of commerce, whether it's in the area of lack of flexibility on education, whether it's in, there are all sorts of areas that we could look at. But
Do you think we should spend less on education?
I think the federal government should be less prescriptive on education, and I think in so doing you can save a lot of money. But those are the activities that the committees and people's elected representatives have to work through. I don't presume to have all of the answers or to know exactly what Congress would do. That's why I'm so excited about Paul Ryan's leadership, is because he's not comes from the policy side, so he's not one who wants to game the system for a predetermined outcome. He's happy to let people's representatives work at it and figure it out, and if you follow the process the way it's supposed to be followed, then you'll get to an outcome that will be the consensus of the group.